knowing where the Red Sea was parted is the question. Where did they go? Where did the Red Sea part? And by extension, we'll hit this more next time, where is Mount Sinai? These are important questions. They're biblical questions. I think they're very interesting questions, but I want to make very clear, these are secondary issues. There are some that every issue of geography in the Bible is a matter of like salvation, figuring out where to, that is not the case. None of this affects the interpretation of this passage. If you're in the IBS class, you know what I'm talking about. The interpretation class, what does this mean, is very clear. But I think it's a lot of fun, and it helps shed light on the Bible and can even affect how we interpret later prophecies based on how you understand this. So let's take a little detour before we get into the story itself and look at this. First, we got to start by looking at the phrase Red Sea. We've all seen the Ten Commandments. We know what the Red Sea looked like, right? This is the Hebrew word, Yam Suf. The word Yam means sea. It's very easy. And the word Suf is the Hebrew word that means reeds. It is a borrowed Egyptian word that means like a papyrus reed. In chapter 2, verse 3, when it says that Moses was taken in the basket and placed among the reeds, that is the same word. He was placed among the Suf. So literally you have here, Sea of Reeds. Now why in the world would you translate that Red Sea? Because it's not like you dropped an E. This isn't English we're talking about here. Well, you get Red Sea from the Septuagint, the LXX, those are Roman numerals that stand for 70, the Septuagint, which was the official Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that is quoted most often in your New Testament. So the Septuagint, when they came to the phrase Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, they translated it Eruthron Thalasan. Y'all know what that is, right? Y'all know what that is. The Eruthron Thalasan. Now what this has led many to conclude here is that when we see Sea of Reeds, what it's talking about is where the children of Israel lived was in the area called the Nile Delta. The Nile is a river that runs north. As it comes to the Mediterranean Sea, it fans out in a sort of triangle shape, and the water disperses as it gets closer to the sea. It makes this area very marshy, very swampy. These reeds grow up in the ground. The water runs through it, and it can be deeper or more shallower depending on the time and depending where you are. And they say this is what it's talking about. It's talking about the children of Israel leaving this part of Egypt, and as they come to this Sea of Reeds, it's basically they're trying to cross the bayou with 3 million people. All right? So you've got to understand this is equally impassable. You're not getting millions of people through that if that's what's going on. However, I don't know if that's the best way to understand this. Some of y'all looking real nervous. Just take it easy, all right? The Greek there, Eruthron Thalasan. I really ought to be able to walk over there, but it's okay. I'm just going to point, okay? The entirety of that water that you see in the south there, we call the Red Sea the big body of water down in the bottom. That's what we call the Red Sea. And then you have two gulfs that are going up around what is now called the Sinai Peninsula. The one that is to the west is called the Gulf of Suez. Maybe you've heard the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a canal that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Gulf of Suez. And the one on the eastern side, your right hand, is the Gulf of Aqaba. That's A-Q-A-B-A, the Gulf of Aqaba. And we look at that, and we're very precise and very scientific, and we have satellite imagery so we can see exactly what's going on there. So in our maps, we have Red Sea, Gulf of Suez, Gulf of Aqaba. At this stage of the game, the Greeks understood the Eruthron Thalasan to refer to that entire body of water and everything that was south of that, including the Indian Ocean. This was their Red Sea, the Eruthros. It means red. So the Red Sea for the Greeks was all that water that was south of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's important for us to know the literal Hebrew is Sea of Reeds. But the translation Red Sea is not a false or faulty translation. It is translating it according to the culture of the day that didn't know this as the Sea of Reeds. They knew this as the Red Sea. And this expands the possibility of where they crossed. Do you understand where the trouble is coming here? Because this would not just have included the Red Sea proper. It would not just have included the Gulfs of Aqaba and Suez. It also would have included most of what is sometimes called the Sea of Reeds, that marshy area near the delta in the north. It would have included that too. So this really makes it a wide open question of where did they cross the Red Sea? Because it's all the Red Sea. You got to be clear about this. Now there are two main options here that are really discussed. There are others, but I'm only going to give you the ones that I feel are at least with some seriousness biblically valid. Because some people want to say they didn't and it was all made up, and others say it makes no sense why they wouldn't go along the Mediterranean Sea, so let's just say they did. The Bible says they didn't. You got two main options here. Number one is that they crossed over the Gulf of Suez, which is, of course, the western antenna of the Red Sea, you can see there. And depending on who you ask, some people would say, well, Sea of Reeds, therefore they would have crossed over in one of those marshy, bayou, swamp kind of areas. Others that are more traditional would say it would have been more to the north, and it actually would have been a sea, as we understand it today, a large body of water. The other option is the eastern option, the Gulf of Aqaba. And that would be at some point, and people argue for the south or the north, and just about everybody who's out there has their own opinion. But those are the two main options, somewhere the north of the Suez or across the Aqaba. And I will say the majority opinion across all of Christendom is the Suez option, the northern option through the reeds. However, as I said, I don't much care for that going through the bayou option. Not because I think it's unbiblical, and let's be very clear, not because I like the version of the movie that has the big water better. Because all I want to do is what the Bible says, not what would make good TV, all right? So we're just going to leave that aside for a minute. But let's look at how the Bible describes the parting of the Red Sea, and how the poetry in Psalms and elsewhere describes it. It talks about the depths. It says the depths overcame them. It talks about great walls of water we're going to read on the sides of them. And when they camp beside it, it's called the sea. They camped by the Yam, the sea. And it seems, at least to me, unlikely that you're sitting next to, it makes sense to call this the Sea of Reeds, but to just call it the sea when it's more or less a swamp seems like an odd choice to me. It seems to indicate deeper water than perhaps waist deep, perhaps neck deep, and perhaps inconsistent depth going through it. And also, as we've seen, for the people at this time, when it was translated Red Sea, it included all of that water. So I think it's more likely that we're talking about either a deeper part of the Suez or a deeper part of the Aqaba. So let's ask ourselves this question now. How far have they gone at this point? Are they still in Egypt, or have they left Egypt? Because if you hold to the western option, the Suez option, you're probably believing that they haven't really left Egypt. They've left their home, they left Goshen, and then the Lord tells them to come back, and they're hanging out on that side of the sea, the Gulf of Suez. In 14 verse 3, we've already read this, that Pharaoh sees them and says they are wandering in the land. Now, of course, the land can just be they're wandering in the desert, they're lost. But it could be that the land is a reference to this land, as in the land of Egypt. But then we're going to see in verse 5 that Pharaoh is going to see that the people had fled, that they had left, and that is what made him so angry. And that's what will precipitate, of course, the army that Pharaoh is going to send out. So you have to ask the question, all right, it kind of could go both ways, but is Pharaoh going to send an army after them if they haven't even left the land yet? Perhaps, but it's a question that needs to be answered. There is a reference, however, in Judges chapter 11, verse 16, where it says this, when they came up from Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and then came to Kadesh. They wouldn't come to Kadesh till much later, but it says they went through the wilderness to the Red Sea. And you could say that the southern part of Egypt, which was less fertile, was more or less a wilderness, or the vast wilderness that separates the two branches of the Red Sea. And then in verses 11 and 12 of this chapter, twice they're going to say, why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? It would be better for us to have died where? In Egypt. Why did you drag us out here? So I really don't see them in Egypt at this point. I think if you want to answer the question, how can Pharaoh say they're wandering in his land? Really, the whole what is now called the Sinai Desert was under the protectorate of Egypt at this point. There's something that runs through the middle of it called the Wadi El Arish. That was the border of Egypt at this time. So even if they are in that wilderness, they're out, but they're technically still under Egypt's jurisdiction, which I think would answer that question. Which would mean they're either coming down the south or the central route through the wilderness, probably, I think, to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the eastern Gulf there. And you might say, well, how did they get there so fast? You have to remember, it says they went out with great haste. Remember that? They didn't let the bread rise. They packed it up, their bowls still with the mix in it, in their back, and they got out of there. And it says that they marched in ranks. Moses was not just, again, makes for great TV, but this is not a mob of people. It's like forward march, and Moses is making them go. The pillar is leading them out into the wilderness. So it seems like they're going pretty quick, and that would certainly answer why they could get there so fast. I also think that this fits because the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, literally there in Hebrew, is not exclusive to this passage. There are other places that talk about the Red Sea, of course, in the Old Testament. And if we look at where they seem to be locating this, I think it is a pretty good case to say that for the average Hebrew living in Israel, talking about the Red Sea was talking about what we now call the Gulf of Aqaba, because it is associated very often with Edom, south of Israel. You remember Edom? The Edomites were the descendants of Esau. They settled in that wasteland down in the south. They're very closely identified with a city called Seir. There's another city called Teman that you might have seen. And they were to the south of Israel, which is exactly what would be adjacent to the Gulf of Aqaba. 1 Kings 9:26, it says that King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. So Solomon built a ship on the shore of the Red Sea, which is in the land of Edom. So that tells you that there's the Red Sea, at least here, is referring to a place in Edom. Jeremiah 49:21, when Jeremiah is declaring a judgment against the land of Edom, it says, at the sound of their fall, the earth shall tremble. At the sound of their cry, it shall be heard at the Red Sea. Now, could that just be referring to really far away? Sure. But, if it's like talking about America and saying, their cry shall be heard from sea to shining sea. You know which seas we're talking about, right? Yeah, okay, the China Sea might work, but you're more obviously going to refer to Atlantic and Pacific, because that's our country. In Deuteronomy 33, verse 2, here's an interesting one. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. That is very interesting. You have Seir, which is the country of Edom, in parallel with Mount Sinai. Now, if Mount Sinai is all the way on the other side in what is today called the Sinai Desert, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense why they would be in parallel with one another. But if we know that the Mount Sinai is more or less directly to the south of Mount Seir in a straight line going up towards Jerusalem, that poetry makes an awful lot of sense. And also we have in Deuteronomy 1 verse 2, it tells us that it is 11 days' journey from Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So in Deuteronomy 1 verse 2, they're giving you directions from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, and the midpoint they give you is Mount Seir, which is in Edom, which is to the south of Israel. So I am inclined to pick that point of view, that Israel fled from Egypt. They went across what is now called the Sinai Wilderness. It wasn't called that then. We call it that now because the traditional place for Mount Sinai is to the south there, and so that's where that name came from. Deep into that wilderness, they encamp alongside the Gulf of Aqaba, the Yam Suf, which would place Mount Sinai and their wilderness in the Arabian Peninsula, not the Sinai Peninsula. Is there anything biblically that says you can't say that? I don't think so. But the other option, which really, I don't really care to fight with you about this. The other option is that they cross the sea some point the north of the Gulf of Suez, with the wilderness itself being that Sinai desert and the Mount Sinai being in the traditional place, which would be at the southern tip right as it gets into the Red Sea proper there. You can't really appeal to tradition because there's Christian tradition, there's Jewish tradition, there's Arabian and Islamic tradition, and they've all got good things to say. But none of it really dismantles what the Bible is teaching. I think the biggest insight that I gained from this is that you need to know that the Red Sea encompasses all of that water. You can't just say that's it and it had to be here. It's referring to all of this. There's one guy who said that there's a synonym in Hebrew, or not a synonym, there's a homonym, a word that sounds the same, which is suf, right? This is the Yam Suf. Suf means reed, but suf as a verb can mean to go far beyond. So he argues that you should translate this not as the Sea of Reeds, but the sea at the end, as in the sea at the end of the world. But that it's never really used that way in Scripture, and he's the only guy that thinks it. So I'm inclined to think maybe he's right, but probably not. I'm just saying that. But if that's our Red Sea, and we know that they're crossing the wilderness to get to the sea, or they're going through the wilderness at any rate, then that's probably where I think it is. I will say this too, though. I don't believe it is a lapse of faith to believe that they did not cross in the deep, traditional deep oceanish type water, right? If you believe that they crossed in the marshy Sea of Reeds up in the north, that is no less a miracle than the big water being parted, right? As long as you believe that it was a miracle. There are some people that say, well, listen, the winds blow through there all the time, and sometimes it's dry, and sometimes it comes, and they happen to get there at just the right time. All right, listen, if you're going to go about trying your best not to believe in miracles, the Bible is going to be a really difficult read for you. I'm just trying to say. This was a miracle. We're going to read through this whole story. You have to believe it was all made up if you're going to say that. And I'm not trying to be funny as I say this. We're all familiar with the depictions of the Red Sea parting and then crossing and crashing over everybody, right? The scene from The Lord of the Rings, where the river overflows and washes away the ring wraiths in the first one. If you've not seen this, you have no idea what I'm talking about, but just work with me here. It may have been something a little bit more like that. Is that any less a miracle than the other thing? No, but we just have to visualize it a little differently. So you're not somehow a bad Christian if you believe that, but I do think you are reading a little too much into the word reeds, because the Bible uses it elsewhere when it very obviously can't mean reeds. It just means that big body of water down there. All of this is interesting, at least it is to me. It's not definitive. You ask me again tomorrow, I might think that the other guy has a better opinion, and it's certainly not essential. As I said, I really don't care to fight about this with you. There are some people that say, but we could find where Mount Sinai is. It's like, and then what? It'd be great, it'd be really cool, but it's not a magic mountain. Right? The only magic mountain is in Six Flags out in California. That's Magic Mountain. If we found it, it'd be cool. It'd be great. And there's some people that believe they have, and there's people that fight about that, right? But all that really we need to know is that the children of Israel have fled from Egypt. They're going to cross the Red Sea. Pharaoh is going to be destroyed. It's going to be a mighty miracle, and then they will be at Mount Sinai before too long. So it's not necessary to understand this passage, but as good Bible students, it's a lot of fun to track down. So go home on your own, do a word study, search up all the places where it says Red Sea, search up all the places where it says Mount Sinai, do some cross-referencing and see what you think.